There are moments in life that last only a few seconds, but those few seconds carry the weight of an entire lifetime. This is the story of one of those moments, a story about a man who had only a few minutes to make a decision that would determine whether 155 people would go home that evening or not go home at all. January 15th, 2009, New York City. It was a cold winter morning, and the city was moving at its usual pace. People were rushing to work, grabbing coffee, checking their phones. LaGuardia Airport was busy as always. Passengers were boarding flights, saying their goodbyes, settling into their seats. Among them were the 150 passengers of U.S. Airways Flight 1549, some traveling for business, some heading home, some just looking forward to landing and getting on with their day. None of them had any idea what the next few minutes would hold. At the front of the aircraft sat Captain Chesley Sullenberger, known to everyone simply as Sully. He was not a young pilot finding his way. He had spent over 4 decades in the sky. He had flown fighter jets in the military. He had trained other pilots. He had spent his entire life learning how to stay calm when everything around him was falling apart. But even Sully, with all his experience, had never faced anything like what was about to happen. At 3:24 in the afternoon, Flight 1549 took off from LaGuardia Airport. The Airbus A320 climbed smoothly into the cold January sky. Passengers relaxed. Some looked out the windows at the city below. Others closed their eyes. The crew carried out their standard procedures. Everything felt completely normal. There was absolutely no reason to believe that disaster was less than 2 minutes away. And then, without any warning, it happened. A large flock of Canada geese appeared directly in the path of the aircraft. There was no time to turn, no time to climb, no time to react. Within a split second, the birds slammed into both engines. The sound was unlike anything the passengers had ever heard. Loud, violent, terrifying. The plane shook. People screamed. Some grabbed the person next to them. Others pressed their faces against the windows, trying to understand what had just hit them. And then came the most frightening part, a silence, a deep, unnatural silence where the roar of the engines used to be. Inside the cockpit, Sully immediately understood what had happened. Both engines had been struck, both were losing power, and the aircraft was now descending over one of the most densely populated cities in the world. He calmly contacted air traffic control. "Mayday, mayday, mayday. We've lost thrust in both engines." The controllers immediately offered him the nearest runway. "Return to LaGuardia," they said. It sounded like the right answer, but Sully was doing the math in his head, and the math was not working out. The aircraft was too low. The distance was too great. If he tried to make it back and failed, the plane could come down on top of buildings, on top of people, on top of the city itself. That was not a risk he was willing to take. The controllers then suggested another airport in New Jersey. Once again, Sully calculated. Once again, the answer came back the same. It wasn't possible. The plane was descending too quickly. Every second that passed was a second of altitude gone forever. And in those seconds, with controllers waiting for his answer and 155 lives depending on his next words, Sully looked ahead and saw something that most people would never consider a landing strip: the Hudson River, a long stretch of cold, dark water running through the heart of New York City. To anyone else, it looked like a terrifying option. To Sully, in that moment, it looked like the only one. He made his decision. "We're going to be in the Hudson." 4 words: calm, certain, no hesitation. The controller asked him to repeat himself, unable to believe what he had just heard. But Sully was already focused on what came next. He and First Officer Jeff Skiles worked through their emergency procedures with the quiet focus of 2 men who had spent their entire careers preparing for a moment they hoped would never come. And over the cabin speakers, Sully's voice came through, steady, measured, almost impossibly calm. "Brace for impact." Those 3 words hit the passengers like a wave. For a moment, the entire cabin went silent, and then reality settled in. People reached for their phones. Last messages were typed. "I love you. Tell the kids. I'm sorry." A woman closed her eyes and tried to picture her daughter's face. A man looked out the window and watched the buildings of New York rush past, and then saw the river getting closer. Some passengers wept quietly. Others sat frozen, gripping their armrests so tightly their knuckles turned white. Many of them genuinely believed these were the last moments of their lives. And yet, in the cockpit, Sully was doing what he had always done, focusing on the one thing he could still control. The aircraft descended toward the water. The city flashed past on both sides. The river filled the windshield. And then, with the kind of precision that can only come from a lifetime of experience, Sully brought the Airbus A320 down onto the surface of the Hudson River. The impact was powerful. A massive spray of water, the plane shuddering and sliding across the surface. Passengers were thrown forward. The cabin shook violently. For a long, terrifying moment, nobody knew what was going to happen next. And then, against every expectation, the aircraft came to a stop. It was damaged. It was sitting in a freezing river, but it was in one piece, and everyone inside was still breathing. The danger, however, was far from over. The water was bitterly cold, cold enough to be fatal if passengers were exposed to it for too long, and the aircraft was slowly beginning to take on water. The crew moved immediately. Emergency exits were opened. Passengers began making their way out onto the wings, stepping out into the freezing air, standing on the body of the aircraft as the river swirled around them. Some were shaking, some were crying, some stood in silence, staring at the New York skyline, unable to fully process the fact that they were alive. But even in that fear and confusion, something remarkable happened. People helped each other. Strangers held strangers. Nobody pushed. Nobody panicked. In one of the most frightening moments imaginable, human beings chose to look after one another. And then help arrived, faster than anyone could have expected. The ferry boats that normally carried commuters across the Hudson had witnessed the landing from the water. Their captains didn't wait for instructions. They didn't wait for permission. They simply turned their boats around and headed straight for the aircraft. Within minutes, the first rescue vessel reached the plane. One by one, passengers were helped off the wings and onto the boats. Rescuers pulled people from the water. Crew members made sure every single person was accounted for. And within 18 minutes of the aircraft hitting the water, all 155 people had been brought to safety. Captain Sully was the last to leave. Before stepping off the aircraft, he walked through the entire cabin, twice, to make absolutely certain that no one had been left behind. Only when he was sure that every single passenger was safe did he finally step off the plane himself. That moment, that quiet act of responsibility, said more about who Sully was than any award or headline ever could. In the days that followed, the world couldn't stop talking about what had happened on the Hudson River. People called it a miracle, and in many ways, it was. But when Sully was asked about it in interviews, he gave an answer that stayed with people long after the cameras were gone. He said it wasn't a miracle. He said it was the result of 40 years of preparation, training, and learning to make the right decision under the worst possible pressure. Experts later ran simulations of the exact same scenario, same location, same altitude, same conditions. And in those simulations, every attempt to reach an airport ended in disaster. Sully had been right. The Hudson was the only option, and he had seen it clearly in a matter of seconds. Today, Flight 1549 sits in the Carolinas Aviation Museum in Charlotte, dented, scratched, and weathered, a permanent reminder of the day that 155 people should have died and didn't, a reminder that sometimes the difference between tragedy and survival comes down to one person, one decision, and a lifetime spent getting ready for a moment that arrives without warning. Sully never called himself a hero, but every one of those 155 people went home that evening, to their families, their children, their lives. And that is a truth that no amount of modesty can change. This wasn't just a story about aviation. It was a story about what human beings are capable of when everything is on the line, about staying calm when panic would be easier, about trusting your experience when there's no time left to think, and about the quiet, unspoken courage of a man who simply refused to give up on the people in his care. On January 15, 2009, in just a few minutes over the skies of New York, one man proved that preparation, experience, and the will to do what is right, even under impossible pressure, can change everything. And all 155 people who walked away from the Hudson River that day are living proof of it.